Good morning, and thank you for joining today's webinar titled Job Descriptions: An Employer's Best Friend or Necessary Evil. My name is Denise Ketty, and I am your moderator for this session. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before introducing today's expert panel. The webinar is going to run approximately 60 minutes in total, and there'll be time at the end of the webinar to address some of your questions. If you have questions during the presentation, please post them to the Q&A area on the dashboard anytime during the presentation. If you have a question that is directed to a specific panelist, you can also note that information when sending in your question. Please take a moment to visit the handouts area on your dashboard so that you can download a copy of today's presentation. If you have any issues during the presentation, please email me directly at denisem.ketty@gmail.com. Just a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded and all accompanying materials are protected by copyright. Our presentation today provides general information and does not constitute legal advice. The advice offered during the webinar is, as of today, June 21st, 2018. As always, we recommend that you consult with your own legal counsel to address your specific situation to ensure that you have the most current information on legal matters. Let's get into our session today. The thought of creating or updating job descriptions can run the gamut of emotions for employers and employees, from excitement to dread. But are job descriptions helpful, or do they just create unnecessary work? Is the language included in the job description really that important? Well, we'll find out. Let me introduce you to our expert panel today to discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of job descriptions. Our legal expert joining us today is Curtis Urian. Curtis is an associate at the law firm of Merhab, Robinson, Jackson & Clarkson, and is in the firm's transactional department where he advises clients in real estate, finance, business succession planning, corporate, and employment law. In addition to his outstanding work at the firm, he has been tapped to contribute articles to law journals and is a part-time lecturer and teaches multiple classes including economics and conscious capitalism and business law and organization, among other classes. Mr. Urian was also recognized by superlawyers.com in 2017 and in 2018 as a rising star. It is worth noting that only 2.5% of attorneys in Southern California are reselected as a rising star. So congratulations on that achievement, Curtis. Our HR expert today is Linda Duffy, president of Ethos Human Capital Solutions. Linda is well known as the people problem solver. If you've been fortunate enough to work with her, you know how committed she is about developing strategies for business leaders to get the right people, systems, and culture in place in their organization so you, as a business owner, can focus on your business and achieve your goals. Linda and her team at Ethos are strategic advisors helping business owners with human resources consulting, recruiting, training, and payroll support. Her clients range from high-tech businesses to manufacturing firms and nonprofit organizations. Linda is extremely well-versed in addressing concerns of founder, CEO-led businesses, and as I've mentioned before, is probably the most connected person I've ever met. Linda, can you get us started this morning?
I sure can, Denise. Thank you so much for that introduction. And Marla sends her regards. She's actually out of the state, taking a little bit of time off, so we're very happy to have Curtis with us today. You'll be able to hear from him in just a little bit. So here's our agenda today. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. And also a special thanks to Judy Hale of Hale Glass for suggesting the topic. If you guys have a topic you'd like us to talk about in the future, feel free to reach out to one of us and let us know that. We're happy to present on anything having to do with employment or employment law, so just let us know. Now, I have to sort of pre-frame today's conversation by saying I personally hate job descriptions. So that was my part, the necessary evil part. I find them to just be really frustrating and a lot of busy work, but they are a necessary evil. And we're going to talk about the ways that you can use job descriptions and why we need them to a certain extent. And I'm also going to mention a couple of other things that I think you can do to improve upon how they're done right now. Okay, somehow, there we go. All right, so one way you certainly can use job descriptions is, to put something together before you recruit. So when you go to recruit for a position, understanding the job before you actually go out to source candidates and talk to people is really important. you especially want to focus on the essential job functions. And we're actually going to spend a lot of time talking about this later. Curtis is going to go over that because it also plays a role in other things such as accommodation for disabilities and those type of issues. You want to also think about, does this person need any sort of special licenses, certifications, or memberships? And that may give you an idea to actually how to recruit. So if you're taking the time up front to put the job description together and you're thinking about, what are the types of essential functions this person has to perform, but also do they have any sort of special memberships that are required? Then that'll give you a clue how to recruit. And I'll give you an example of that. Right now, we're working with a property management client of ours, and they're looking for a community manager. There's a certification that is a CCAM, or the Certified Community Association Manager. And so knowing that and knowing about the essential job functions and what they're going to do to manage these communities, we can search resume databases and go on LinkedIn and look for people that have that certification. We can also see whether the association has a way for us to post a job with it. So if you spend the time up front to figure out what this person has to do in the position, and also take a look at those sort of unique aspects about how this person might be qualified, then that would give you a good idea of how to go about sourcing candidates. Now, I also say don't use the job description as a job posting. There is absolutely nothing sexy about job descriptions, and I think we can all agree. So I pulled this off last night, just off of Indeed.com. I blacked out the name of the company, just, protect the guilty in this case. But here's an assistant manager position, and it's literally just like as dry as can be. There is nothing here that would excite anybody about applying for this position, right? So take a look at a different type of assistant manager, and this is for PetSmart. I wish I could put the whole ad in here because I thought it was so cleverly written as it goes through, and you really see the personality. Like, it uses phrases like all paws on deck, right? Because they're talking about a dog hotel or a pet hotel. It's certainly playful. It has some personality, so it's going to attract the right people to the store. So you want the job description related to the ad, but don't use it as the ad itself. And the other thing I'll just point out, and I didn't want to put up examples of this, but you can find them easily, is remember to watch your language in the job description, and then also in any associated ads, that you're not using any language that's discriminatory in any way. Like when Curtis and I met to prepare for this webinar last week, he was talking about I think it was even a friend of his that had posted an ad and even said in the ad, like, we're looking for people between this age and this age. Okay, so you certainly don't want to do anything like that. So this will be my thinking on, you can use job descriptions for recruiting, but don't use the actual job description for posting, which is the most common thing I see out there. And especially in this job market, I was just looking in Orange County anyway. I know we have people online from all over the place, but in Orange County, California, our unemployment rate is down below 3%. It's a tough, tough market for recruiting. So you need to jazz it up, and you need to figure out other ways to go, find talent. And posting the example on the left here is not going to do it, in my opinion. The other thing I'll say is when we go out to do recruiting, and this is one of the reasons I don't personally like job descriptions, is they're static, right? Like, you look at this and you say, okay, prepare teacher's work schedule, check email and phone messages, prepare a payroll sheet, but it doesn't tie back to the company's overall goals. When we do recruiting, we put together what we call a success profile, and it basically answers the question, what does this person have to do to be successful? So yeah, they have to prepare teachers' work schedule, but how often, how accurately, how are you going to measure success? Is it done on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis? Like, there's nothing about that that tells you exactly how you're going to measure success. So that's a discussion for another day in more detail, but I would just thought I would throw that out to you. So if you're using the job description for recruiting, you can certainly use it for interviewing as well. So, some of the tasks might be like identify new markets to penetrate if it's a salesperson or something like that, drive revenue, manage accounts. So then you could, take some questions and develop some behavioral-based interview questions tied back to that. So it could be, tell me about a new market you penetrated and the steps you took to do so. How much revenue did you bring in last year? You know, if you're trying to get people to drive revenue in different ways, then you would break down that question. But it all is going to tie back to that job description, or in our case, a success profile. These questions here actually were directly taken from a success profile from a position that we filled a few years ago for a client, where it didn't just say identify new markets to penetrate. Our success profile said during the first year, identify 3 new markets and drive revenue of at least 1.5 million, which is even more specific and definitely more measurable. So you can use the job descriptions for recruiting, you can use them for interviewing, and then once the person's on board or right before they come on board, another use would be for the pre-placement physicals. And this is where I do see value in the job description, because the part that the clinic's going to need to know about are all the working conditions and the physical demands on the position. So a couple thoughts about how to use these for pre-placement physicals is make sure you use a standardized practice. Sometimes I have clients say, well, if we're going to, insist on one person having a physical, do we have to do it for everybody? My answer is you have to do everybody that is similarly situated. So for example, I have a client, another property management client, they wouldn't necessarily have to give the physicals to every single person that applies for a job there, or before an offer is made, after an offer is made, but they could select out a certain group. Like they could say, I'm just going to have physicals done on our maintenance workers, but not on our office staff. That's perfectly acceptable. But you don't want to say, I'm going to do physicals on maintenance workers who are over the age of 50. Like you wouldn't want to do that, because then you're going to get into, a discrimination claim there. You want to use a clinic that specializes in occupational medicine. So like US HealthWorks, there's a whole bunch of them around here, but you want to make sure that they know what they're looking for, and it's not just like a standard doctor's office where they're going to see colds and flus. I mean, you want somebody that knows a little bit more about what goes on in a workplace. Take your job descriptions to them. Either give them access to them online, you can take a notebook to them and give them, so that way when somebody comes in from your organization, the doctor knows exactly what he or she's looking for, right? So they know the essential job functions. They can tell from the physical demands and the working conditions, maybe what, they have to maybe certify somebody in personal protective equipment, for example. Like, let's say you have an inhalation hazard and somebody has to wear a mask, they need to be clean shaven. So there's things like that they can help you design further testing. They can help you figure out whether or not this person can actually meet those essential job functions. And that's going to be really critical to make sure that you hire people that can do the job. And then the other thing I would say about that is, make sure that you're making the offer contingent upon passing the pre-placement physical, but you shouldn't do the physical until after a job offer is made. So you make the offer, then you do the physical. So it's post-offer pre-placement. So once the person's on board, as you're going through that onboarding or orientation process, what we suggest is you create an onboarding plan that's actually tied to the job description. So think about, okay, here are all the things this person has to do. What does their first day, week, month look like? Who are the people I need to meet with inside the organization or outside the organization? Certainly their direct boss would be one, but let's say you're hiring somebody in accounting, maybe they need to also, meet with or at least talk to the payroll provider, right? If it's an outside payroll service, or, if they're doing 401k, they need to meet the 401k broker or the third-party administrator or something like that. What login information do they need? Do you need to order equipment for them? So it's a really good sort of almost checklist. If you sit down and you say, okay, in order for this person to do this job with these tasks we just laid out for them, then what do they need to do in those first day, weeks, months in order to be successful in this role? Okay, compensation. Every company should have at least a compensation philosophy. And I know a lot of you on this call do not have a formal structure, and that is okay. But I'm going to tell you a quick story about one of our clients that got themselves in trouble because they were paying an outside female sales rep that lived in Nevada less than her male counterpart in California. And I was like, of course they are, because she's in Nevada, right? It's a lower cost of living. But the EEOC didn't see it that way. And then we got called in after that. And what they said is you can have a compensation philosophy that says we're going to pay based on location as one of the factors, but they didn't have a written compensation philosophy. So what I would suggest to you is have something written down someplace that says this is what we pay based on. Is it tied to the job description? I mean, it needs to be in part, right? Is it tied to the knowledge, skills, and abilities? Is it tied to education and experience? You need to make sure, of course, that you're only considering things that are directly related to the person's ability to do the job. So for example, sometimes I've seen people get in trouble because, like, let's go back to our accounting position. Maybe you hire somebody as a controller, they have a CPA license, but they're not using the CPA license in the job as a controller for a privately held business. So you shouldn't pay them for the fact that they have a CPA license. You can pay them based on, the knowledge, right? But it's the ability to do those essential job functions. So think about in your job descriptions, you want to make sure that you're also creating differences that will allow people to compare one job to another. And again, that same company I mentioned, in their sales department, they had pretty much everybody thrown into one job description. And so when EEOC came in and they looked at the different pay rates, they didn't have job descriptions that really backed that up. And so when we went in and we brought a comp consultant in also, we worked with them to to designate new positions. So now there's a sales manager, there's a sales engineer, there's a sales rep, and there's a sales associate. So there's actually 4 different levels. And then even then the EOC came back and said, well, wait a second, how come the female in the department is paid so much less? And we said, she's in a trainee position. That sales associate is a trainee position. And they said, well, we don't think there's a big enough difference in the essential job functions to warrant the difference in pay. So you need to really spend some time looking at the job descriptions to make sure it's an accurate reflection of what people do, and also that you've really clearly delineated the level of experience and the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they have in order to perform those essential functions. Just a quick reminder, equal pay laws in California are even more onerous than they are at the federal level, in that California requires you to be able to justify pay differences essentially to the penny. So if you're paying somebody different, you can pay people based on tenure, seniority in the company, performance, certainly things like that. But you should be able to start with the job description, and then for any changes after that, when you bring somebody in, keep track of how those pay increases and why the compensation may be different from one person to another. Okay, another way we would use the job description is for exempt determination. So when we get called in to do this for clients, we'll go in, they say we want to make sure that, everybody in these positions that we have as salaried exempt should be exempt. And of course, one of the first things we're going to do is ask to see the job descriptions. We would, of course, always look at the salary because that's one requirement for each of the different positions, but we would also make sure that the language is consistent with what they're doing, number one, but also consistent with their FLSA status. So for example, all of the white collar exemptions are going to have the requirement that you exercise independent discretion and judgment. Well, so you don't want to say things like, implement what your boss does or says to do, things like that, right? You want to make sure that it says that they are going to use discretion and judgment to do whatever. So you want to make sure that you're throwing in the language to back up, the exempt status. For example, the executive one has a requirement to manage 2 or more full-time employee equivalents. So I would expect in the section on the job description, when it asks if this person's in a supervisory role, that it would say yes, and that maybe it says this position customarily manages 10 people, something like that. And I would also expect to see tasks that are related to management, like hiring, firing, scheduling, all of those that I have listed there. Similarly, the professional exemption, licenses and certifications are required. So those should be listed, as well as the advanced knowledge that they need to perform that essential function. And then similar for outside sales and computer professionals. On computer professionals, remember, we're not talking about help desk people. Their salary is much higher. It's in the 90,000 range now. But it's really at a higher level in terms of coding, in terms of enterprise management. And so you want to make sure, again, the job description is the first place people are going to look. So you want to make sure that the language there is consistent and is going to back up your claim that this position is exempt. Okay, also performance appraisals and development plans. So Obviously, it's really easy at job description, to use that during the performance appraisal. Most performance appraisals are going to make comments about the person's ability to do the job, obviously, about the skills necessary. So it's a great way to compare the person's actual performance against their job duties as you set them forth on the job description. Similarly, if they're not meeting those job descriptions, duties, or maybe you want to promote them. So you're looking at, now I'm a sole contributor, but I've expressed interest, or you've seen in me my ability to manage people. So we can take a look then at the job description for manager and say, okay, what competencies does Linda have, and where maybe there's a gap that I would need in order to be ready to move up into that management role. So it could be remedial, like to keep my job, or to improve my performance in some way, or it could be to get promoted. But either way, again, we're going to tie it back to the job description, look at those duties, look at the competencies involved, and then see, okay, how do I stack up against that, or do I need some help getting to that next level? And then return to work interactive process. And this is the last thing I'm going to talk about before I turn it over to Curtis for a while, is if somebody's injured on the job, can they return to work and perform the essential job functions? This comes up all the time for workers' comp matters. Somebody gets hurt when it's not work-related. It could happen after a leave of absence for pregnancy or some other disability. Somebody could be gone with cancer for a while, and then they're ready to come back to work. And so again, we're going to want a doctor to certify that they're able to return to work, and we're going to want to know, do they have any restrictions? And then the question is going to become, especially this happens in workers' comp a lot, is going to be, can we provide them with modified duty if they do have restrictions? Can they do the essential job functions with or without accommodations? And we need to engage in that interactive process as we're bringing them back to work. If they get released to return to work and perform their full duties, great. But if there's any sort of restrictions, then we need to go through that process. Just remember, we always go by what the doctor says and not by what the employee says. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis to talk about what goes into a job description. Curtis, take it away.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Denise, for the lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone this morning on our webinar on job descriptions. And it's a pleasure to be able to have the opportunity here to talk about a legal perspective on job descriptions and what we look for when we are preparing and reviewing job descriptions. A couple comments first before I dive in here into what specifically we would recommend including in a job description. Job descriptions are not legally required. I don't know, and I'm not aware of any law that says that an employer must have a job description for any employee or for any position. A job description I like to compare job descriptions to employee handbooks, as handbooks are not legally required. A job description can either help or hurt the employer. A job description can help the employer if it's prepared properly and includes all of the correct and proper information that we recommend. And it could hurt an employer, just as Linda described earlier in the webinar. So when you go to prepare a job description, you see on the slide here that the first section is going to be a header, and it's going to have just a basic description of what the job description is, and it's going to provide some basic information. Now, as we go through our example of what to include in a job description, we're going to use an example of a specific position. We're going to use the example of an accounting specialist. Now, as you go through each line, you can see we have the job title, accounting specialist, who it's going to report to, the date the job description was created, the supervisor, status, and the salary grade. Now, this is all important information as you want the employee to know this basic information as they go into their position. And as we move on, the purpose of a job description should be included. And this is the why of why the position exists, why we're going to hire you into this position. and it should include a philosophy of what the position is going to be doing. So if it's an accounting specialist, this is going to be a person that is going to assist with the financials of the company. It's going to be somebody that's going to assist with paying accounts, receiving revenue and checks, assisting with payroll, that type of stuff. And you can also talk about how the position contributes to the company or to the department. And after you describe what the purpose of the position is, then you want to get into the essential job functions. And as Linda described earlier, you want to list out what the essential job functions are, because it's going to relate to possible accommodations that an employee might request. Now, this could come up during the interview and hiring process, or an employee could become injured or disabled during employment and request an accommodation. And an employer is required to provide a reasonable accommodation that allows the employee to perform their essential job functions. And to make that analysis of whether the accommodation is reasonable and whether it places an undue hardship on the employer, we have to first know what the essential job functions of the position are. And one way of thinking about it is the essential job functions are the tasks that an employee must perform as part of that position. So if we use our example of an accounting specialist is going to be required to use accounting tools, is going to be required to know how to do arithmetic, is going to be required to know how to use different computer applications. And you can see here on the slide, this is a sample list of our essential duties and responsibilities for an accounting specialist. So, talking a little bit more about essential job functions, it is the employer's responsibility to establish what the essential job functions are, but it is the employee's responsibility to establish that the employee is able to perform the essential job functions with or without a reasonable accommodation. There are several cases on this topic on whether an employee is able to perform an essential job function. We have listed here an example of a case that came out of the Fifth Circuit just last year, where the court said that reporting to work regularly is an essential job function. That might seem common sense, but it doesn't surprise me at all that somebody filed a lawsuit claiming that showing up to work is not an essential job function, which it clearly is. And we have another case referenced here where a pharmacist was phobic, afraid of needles, and requested a job accommodation. And because the pharmacist does not perform immunizations, the pharmacy was not required to provide an accommodation because the employee was not required as an essential job function to perform immunizations. And recently there were some cases out of California courts that have held similar results. Recently, an employee filed a lawsuit against their employer the employee was a disposal truck driver and was required to push large disposal bins that weighed anywhere from 800 to 2,000 pounds, depending on whether they were fully loaded. And the employee was injured, suffered a knee injury, and the employee requested an accommodation of not pushing these large disposal bins. And the employer said, no, we can't provide that accommodation because it's the essential job function to push these bins and to drive this truck. And the court, fortunately, held for the employer and found that the employee was the accommodation that the employee was requesting was not reasonable. And whenever it comes up, whenever an employee requests a job, an accommodation to to be able to make an essential job function, we always recommend that you consult with legal counsel, even if it's a simple job accommodation. We recommend consulting with legal counsel so that the company can engage in the good faith interactive process of communicating with the employee regarding the accommodation, and to analyze whether the accommodation is reasonable and whether the company can provide it. So we've talked here about reasonable accommodations. And I want to talk real quickly about when it becomes an undue hardship, when a reasonable accommodation becomes an undue hardship. Had an example with a client not too long ago. The client had an employee that was injured at work and went on temporary disability through workers' comp for a while. And when the employee returned to work, the employee was given several restrictions from the employee's doctor. And the employee was in a position where the employee had to produce a certain number of, we'll say, widgets every day. And this employee, because of the injury, was not able to produce the expected number of widgets every day. And so the employer had to have a conversation with the employee about performance and about production. And it turns out that production and performance cannot be sacrificed when it comes to making and requesting making or requesting an accommodation. Productivity standards or quality standards do not have to be sacrificed in order to make an accommodation. And in this example that I just discussed, the employee had to be let go because this employee was not capable of producing the number of products that the employee was supposed to produce every day. And that could become a problem with other employees as well. If other employees see that employee A is only producing 50 products a day, whereas everyone else is required to produce 100 products a day, they might ask, well, why is this person getting away with underperforming? Why can't I underperform? And so it can become a sensitive subject. And just to emphasize, quality and productivity standards do not have to be sacrificed as an undue hardship. And an undue hardship could mean that the accommodation would be unduly costly, could be unduly extensive, could be substantial or disruptive, or would fundamentally alter the nature or operation of the business. And there are several factors that should be analyzed in determining whether an accommodation is going to create an undue burden. And again, whenever an employee makes a request for an accommodation, we recommend that employers consult with legal counsel so that the legal counsel can help and assist in determining whether an accommodation has undue hardship. Okay, moving on. So if the employee is going to have any kind of supervisory responsibilities, it should be set forth in the job description. We recommend using position titles instead of names because names change. People change positions, but the company structure and the organization might stay the same. So the position will still be reporting to a specific position, even though the people in those positions may change over time. And we also recommend that job descriptions include education and experience. One note on this is we want to make sure that in the education experience section, the employer separates out the education that's required, that the employee must have for the position, and the education that is preferred. For our example here of an accounting specialist, we require 5 years of experience working in accounting, but we prefer a bachelor's degree. Another example could be take an attorney in a law firm. An attorney in a law firm must have a 4-year degree and must have a law degree and must have bar passage. But an attorney can ask for a preferred education of a bachelor's degree being in a specific field, such as a hard science field. And I want to make another comment here regarding education experience related to making an analysis or determination for exempt status. Some of the exemptions require an employee to have a certain type of education. And so if you're going to have a position that you want to make exempt, and it's a type of exemption that requires a certain kind of education, you're going to want to make sure that the job description lists out that the employee has that education. Because when it comes to making analyses for exempt status, the job description can be a very helpful tool. As I mentioned earlier, job descriptions can either help or hurt employers. And when it comes to making an exempt analysis, the job description, again, can either help or hurt. I often make exempt analyses for clients, and every time I ask the client to provide me with a copy of the job description. And sometimes the job descriptions are great. They include lots of detail, and sometimes they're very vague and very brief and don't include very much detail. A well-written job description is going to be a lot more helpful in determining whether an employee is an exempt employee and if it's prepared properly. Moving on, knowledge section, you want to make sure that you have a section in the job description that discusses knowledge, but what the employee must know. So for example here, if this accounting specialist is going to be helping out with payroll, we want the accounting specialist to have a knowledge of California labor employment laws and a knowledge of accounting principles. And moving on to skills, I'm not sure if driving a forklift is always going to be an accounting specialist position, but apparently for this company, this is a construction company that we pulled this job description from. If the position is going to require duties that are beyond or outside of, or if the position is going to have require skills that are outside or beyond what you would normally expect for that position, you're going to want to make sure and list it. And you can see here, for skills, an accounting professional is going to need to know how to use a 10-key adding machine. It's going to need to know how to use a computer and different accounting software, Excel, and numbers. And abilities. It's good to list out what abilities the employee needs to be able to perform. And just so moving on, we have an example here of what we have in our job description for our accounting professional. Managing files, records, designing forms, knowledge of QuickBooks and Microsoft Office, ability to communicate, ability to monitor. All good examples of what we would include in a job description. Moving on to competencies. These are, again, more items that we want the employee to be able to have in performing their essential job functions. Here's some examples here. Like if you're going to have an accounting specialist that is working with others, you're going to want somebody that's interpersonal. You're going to want somebody that works well with others. If you're going to have an accounting specialist that's going to hide in a dark cave and crunch numbers and pay bills, then you're going to want somebody who's self-driven and doesn't need much supervision. These are all ideas, competencies that you want to think about and analyze for each position. Next section is an important one. This is going to relate back to the essential job functions, physical demands and working conditions. Just as a note, the employer has a responsibility of providing a safe workplace for their employees. I often get questions of, well, what kind of safety measures should I provide my employees? What kind of personal protection equipment should we provide? And usually I can help out, but if ever an employer is not sure about safety requirements or personal protection equipment, the OSHA does offer a program where an OSHA inspector can come out and help you analyze, well, just observe and analyze what an employee does and can tell you what kind of safety equipment, what kind of safety precautions and procedures need to be in place. The only trade-off with that is once you invite OSHA into your business and they tell you what you need to change and do, they're going to come back and make sure that you've made all the changes. But my preference is to welcome OSHA in because I don't always know what OSHA is going to say or what OSHA is going to think. But these types of safety things and working conditions, these are items that are going to want to be included in a job description. And we can see on this slide right here, this is a check the box process that an employer could use in determining working conditions. Stand, walk, sit, stoop, kneel, crouch, bend, lift, climb. And these are all items that an employer should evaluate and consider when creating a job description. If it's an accounting professional, they're probably going to spend a lot of time walking and sitting. It could be the situation where the applicant or the employee has a disability that prevents the employee from sitting 8 hours at a time. And so the employee might request an accommodation that allows the employee to stand for certain periods of time. And the employer would have to determine whether this accommodation is reasonable and whether it's an undue hardship. And not just sitting or standing, but any other physical demand the employer would have to consider. Again, with working conditions, again, California law requires that employers provide a safe working space. But if we know we're going to have an employee that will take, for example, that's going to work in extreme cold, say we have a food distribution company that provides goods that need to be refrigerated, and the company has a large walk-in freezer, the employer needs to tell the employee that they can expect to be working in an extreme cold situation. One, to figure out if the employee is able to perform that function, is able to go into the extreme cold, and two, to figure out what kind of safety or personal protection equipment needs to be provided so that the employee can go into an extreme cold situation. Some other items to think about: security clearance, travel requirements, special licenses or certificates. If you're going to hire a tax accountant, you're going to want to see a CPA license. Or an attorney, you're going to want to see a bar membership. And a few more comments here on job descriptions. Job descriptions are not contracts. They're not legally required and they're not contracts. It is a list of the functions that the employee is going to perform. and it's a list of conditions that the employee is going to work in. If an employer prepares a job description and provides it to the employee, the job description should have several disclaimers. One, we want to remind the employee that the employee is an at-will employee. And two, we want the employee to know that the job description is not an exhaustive list of all their job duties, that as an at-will employee, the employer has the right to change those job duties at any time without notice. I've had several situations where an employer tries to transfer an employee to a different position or modify an employee's duties. And the employee will sometimes complain, well, this isn't included in my job description. I wasn't asked to do this. And the reality is it doesn't matter. Employees are at-will employees, and the employer can change job descriptions at any time without notice. That being said, when we provide a job description to an employee, we want the employee to read, understand, and acknowledge that they received it. So when an employee signs a job description, they're not signing a contract, rather they're representing that they've read, received, and understand their job description, and understand that their job duties and responsibilities can change at any time.
All right, Curtis, thank you so much. That was great, walking us through all of those different sections of a job description. I want to wrap up and then we'll take some questions. So I'll just say, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat section over on your dashboard or in the question section if that shows up for you. This is the last content slide. I want to just jump out of our PowerPoint for a second to show you a couple of websites that I think that you'll find really helpful when you go to write job descriptions. That is, of course, something that you can hire us to do if you want to just outsource that, because they are time consuming. But I'm going to give you a really simple sort of wizard that's free that you can do online if you want to do it that way as well. So there's different methods of developing job descriptions. You certainly can sit down and interview people, ask them what they do, how do they spend their time, you know, what do they think the requirements are, that type of thing. We usually recommend that you interview the employee, but also recommend you interview their supervisor just to sort of sanity check what the employee says. You can also, and this is pretty effective, use observation, right? You sort of shadow the person around, get a handle, you know, mentally on like where are they spending their time, you know, what's the exposure like, are they standing, are they sitting, you know, what are they doing during their time. That can take a little bit longer, but sometimes you can combine these, again, maybe just sanity check what they say they're doing by observing them for a while. There's also, you can develop your own questionnaire, but I'm going to jump out of here and then just go to a website where this ONET Resource Center, it's sort of a pseudo-government type center. It's run by, I can't remember, someplace in North Carolina, South Carolina. I think there's a grant. But this is basically, you can get all of these different questionnaires that you can download. They have it in a zip drive you can see down here toward the bottom. And you can just download all of these questionnaires, and it will actually come up with ways that you can evaluate, you know, abilities, education, training, all of this thing here. So they have it in PDF. They also have it in Word format. So I just wanted to mention that. And then also they do have some of the questionnaires that are in Spanish as well, if that's helpful. The other thing I wanted to show you, though, this is a job description writer. So this is super easy to use. So let's say that we're going to hire somebody in accounting. We can just put, you know, the word accounting in. We can look for California and search, and it's going to bring up a list. So let's just take, you know, accountants. Let's just take accountants as the example. It's actually going to bring up sort of a job description, like a generic job description. You can decide whether you want to include or exclude these different categories by clicking on the box. And you can also edit this. So let's say for your accountant, you know, maybe there's some specialized knowledge they need or something like that. You can click on edit and it will bring this up. and you can just type in here, or you can remove something. You can make it more specific, whatever it is. And then once you make the changes, you just click down here, and then you can review and download the final job description, and then you can export it into Word, a PDF, whatever format you want down here. You can print it, you can email it to yourself. So I find this really helpful because sometimes if I'm looking at a new position I don't know that much about, or I just want to sort of jumpstart it so I'm not starting from scratch on a job description, this is a great way to do it. You can also just use this to sort of create your own templates to use if that's what you want to do, especially when it comes to just remembering to consider everything, like the different sections on the job description. It's a great information to have there. So I just wanted to share those two with you. You have the links right here, so you can follow those. And if you just go to careeronestop.org or you go to ONET Center, you'll find that information. So hopefully that was helpful. And Denise, I'm going to turn it back over to you to coordinate our questions.
Great, thanks for all that information. That's a lot of good information on both sides, on the HR side and on the legal side, and what to watch out for. So if you do have questions and you haven't had a chance to post them, please post them to the Q&A section on your dashboard. We'll do our best to answer all the questions, and if we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with you. First question that I have came in from Nicole. What if someone refuses to do something that is listed in their job description? Linda, you can take that one.
Sure, fire them. No, just kidding. I wouldn't start with that, although I'd like to sometimes. I think the only thing that's really important is you find out why they're refusing to do it, right? Is it, they have some sort of limitation, physical limitation, something like that, that maybe you have to engage in the interactive process. But as Curtis just pointed out, as an employer, you have the right to change the terms and conditions of their employment anytime. So it doesn't matter that there's a written job description that says something. We do recommend, just so you can avoid the noise of this conversation, always put the other duties as required on the list of essential job functions. But even if it's not there, you have the right to manage the employee. You have the right to change the terms and conditions of their employment, including their job duties. So don't be afraid to basically sit them down and have that conversation with them and say, hey, you need to do this job. But unless there's some sort of physical limitation or something like that that would prevent them from doing it, in which case then we move over into that whole reasonable accommodation conversation and interactive process. They need to do the job task.
Great. Next question came in from Vanessa, and I'm going to probably have both of you weigh in on this, Linda from the HR perspective, and then also Curtis from the legal perspective. How is the best way to handle a situation when a hiring manager brings someone on board and then asks the employee to write their job description? Is it reasonable or legal or not the best practice? I'm thinking not the best practice there, but I've seen it happen. But I've seen it happen before, and it seems like it could be a big area of risk. So, Linda, could you take us through on the HR perspective, and then Curtis, maybe you can answer on the legal perspective.
Sure. Vanessa, I would say, yeah, definitely not the best practice, but there's nothing wrong with having the employee take the first shot at it. I wouldn't just take whatever the employee says, and especially a new employee. But maybe, I can think of scenarios where it could work as a starting point. Like maybe it's a new, it's something new for the company. Maybe there isn't somebody in this role. Maybe you hire somebody with a certain level of expertise and they know more about what it takes to do that job than the existing employee. So I can imagine a few limited scenarios where maybe the employee is the best one. But if you're talking about like regular rank and file employees, I hire an assembler out on the shop floor, here, write your job description. That's probably not how I would do it. But even if you have the employee write the job description, I would always certainly have a second set of eyes look at it, whether it's human resources, their supervisor, both of those people, something to make sure that it's an accurate reflection of the job. Curtis, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to chime in, yeah, I entirely agree with what you just said, Linda, and it's not the best practice, and it's not something I would recommend doing. But like you said, it could be a situation where it's the first employee you're hiring into this new position, and you're not really quite sure what to include in the job duties. yeah, I could see that happening. But just like you said, Linda, I would, after the employee writes a first draft, I would take it and I would revise it and have another set of eyes look at it and make any changes necessary.
Great. Let's see. We have a question from Deborah, and it's a good question. It's, how do you advise employers to write a concise and appealing job description, such as your PetSmart example, Linda, while still addressing the suggested knowledge, skills, abilities, physical demands, working conditions that was presented in the second part of the webinar from Curtis? It seems like the job posting would become really long, a long list of things that would be maybe assumed. Is it better to have two versions, one to attract an applicant and one that is more detailed? What would your advice be, Linda?
Okay, great question, Deborah. So I put up the examples, those were ads, right? And my point of pointing those two out was one used the job description as the ad and the other one wrote an ad based on the job description. And to me, those are two very different things. Personally, I don't think there's anything sexy about a job description. Like I said earlier, it is so boring to me when I read through them because it's this static list of stuff. They're hard to maintain. You know, most employers, have the employees sign them. They stick it in a folder or their employee file, or that goes in a notebook someplace, never to be seen again until somebody gets hurt or something like that. So what I would suggest is this: is you take a look at the job description, and in the ad, you basically appeal to people about what's great about working in this job while still working in a couple of critical things that you need, maybe in terms of requirements for the position or critical functions. So for example, I was looking back at some examples of ads that I wrote before. Like I have a client that I do work with that runs, like, we'll call them pet hotels, right? So we were looking for a manager, and so we wrote an ad to basically work in what they'd be doing along with some things that we're looking for. So we really wanted someone that had great interpersonal skills to deal not only with pets, right, and become their best friend, but also with pet owners, right? And if you have pets, you get a little crazy when it comes to, protecting your fur babies, right? And so instead of writing, like interface with customers, we would write something like, we want you to use your great interpersonal skills to, charm, the parents of the fur babies, basically, right? Something like that. So we would work in both of those things into the ad and post it. You can always also link an ad to a job description, or something like if you're using an applicant tracking system, we upload our whole success profile, but we don't necessarily go post that, if that makes sense. If you want to, reach out separately, and run something by me, I'm happy to talk it out with you to see if we can construct something for you. But just think about if there's anything critical that the person must have in order to be hired, like Curtis's examples, you need to have passed the bar, you need to have a law license, something like that. You would certainly want to put that in there. But otherwise, think about what's attractive to a candidate. What are their opportunities? What are they going to be able to learn? Or what are they going to be able to contribute? Or just, what's going to be really attractive about the position, and focus on that. That would be my best advice.
And just to add to what Linda said there, a long, detailed job description is going to be good and it's going to be helpful, but I wouldn't necessarily just copy and paste it over into the ad. And one reason why I wouldn't do that is because I've been on the other end. I've been an applicant before, and when I've seen these long job descriptions, I don't read them. I'm not going to take the time. I just want to know what the bullet points are. Hey, what am I doing? Am I qualified for this job? I'm not going to take the time as an applicant to read a long, detailed job description.
Yeah, and if you ever want to test that theory, because I agree with you, Curtis, I used to do this all the time, especially if there's a position that requires great attention to detail or the ability to follow written instructions. I would, toward the bottom of an ad, I would actually write in order for us to review your resume, please put this code in, or respond and say this. Like, give them a specific instruction to follow. And I will tell you that will narrow down your field right away. So in an environment like this, where we have such low unemployment and everybody's fighting for talent right now and finding it hard to find, you know, you have to ask yourself how much you want to screen out your people at that level. But I have definitely used those type of techniques in recruiting before to see if people can follow instructions. But I will tell you, most people are not going to read the whole job description. They're going to go by the title or read the first paragraph and then hit apply if they're looking for a job. All right, Denise, I think we're out of time, so I just want to thank everybody for attending today. Up on the screen, you can see our email addresses, so if you need assistance writing job descriptions, reviewing them for exempt status, you have questions about reasonable accommodation, feel free to reach out to one of us. We're going to take July and August off. Just a reminder though, if you have ideas for jobs for future webinars, please email us those topics. And then if you want to see any of our prior webinars that we've done on various topics, if you miss us too much in the next couple of months, just go out to YouTube and you'll find our YouTube channel out there with all of them posted. Denise, anything to wrap up?
Great. No, that's it. Thank you, everybody, for participating. We know that you have a busy day, and we appreciate you spending some time with us and asking a lot of good questions. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.